upon which the United Nations headquarters stands, politically designated as New York City, is the homeland of the Lenape, who were violently displaced as a result of European settler colonialism over the course of 400 years. The Lenape are a diasporic people that remain closely connected to the lands and are its rightful stewards. Family Service Toronto and Campaign 2000 acknowledge the traditional and ancestral territories that we work on and commit to actions of reconciliation in our work. We acknowledge the inherent rights of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and the treaty rights, titles, and jurisdictions of all First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples across the country of Canada. We will continue to join with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in the work of decolonization and to advocate for the changes needed to uphold rights and to build a society based on equity, justice, respect, and self-determination where all communities can thrive. I will also acknowledge that the lands that I am calling in from, Tekaronto, colonially known as Toronto, is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. These lands and this nation, and indeed all of us, are subject to the One Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the land and its resources. I encourage those of you who are on Turtle Island in North America to learn about the lands you are situated on. As we get started, please do introduce yourself to us in the chat. And if you know the lands you're on, please do include those. And for those in Canada, you can visit nativelands.ca to learn more about the lands you're on, and we will put that link into the chat. We'll now have the honor of hearing some opening remarks from Canada's Sustainable Development Goals Unit. It's my pleasure to introduce Isabelle Lever-Chiasson, a Senior Policy Analyst with the SDG Unit at Employment and Social Development Canada. Previously, Isabelle worked with the Canadian Commission for UNESCO as the Education Program Officer responsible for engaging Canadians in UNESCO programs in Canada and abroad and providing strategic advice to federal governments. Isabelle, thank you for being here today, and I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes, great. What an honor to be here with all of you virtually. A big thank you for inviting me to speak. And thanks, Layla, for the beautiful land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that I am actually joining you from Ottawa, so the ancestral, traditional, unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people of the Great Algonquin Nation. And as the introduction says, my name is Isabelle Lever-Chiasson. So I am Senior Policy Analyst in the Sustainable Development Goals Unit at Employment and Social Development Canada. So just a bit of background about who we are and what we do. For those that are unaware, our unit was created in 2018. So we support the Minister of Jobs and Families that is responsible for implementing the 2030 agenda in Canada. And the unit was really created as a focal point for the federal government. So we coordinate efforts with all the different departments, raise awareness, monitor, report the implementation of the 2030 agenda, really from a perspective of a whole of society approach, which is a great link to the event that is happening today. We also, the 2030 agenda provides a framework for responding to concurrent crises that we are currently seeing today, and really looking at building back better and building resilience to future shocks, and the opportunities also to build a more peaceful, just, prosperous, sustainable world. So as you might be aware, the 2030 agenda includes 17 really interlinked Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and they really cover the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. And human rights really unites these dimensions, and their relationship with the SDGs is mutually reinforcing. So, like the significance of understanding the relationship between the SDGs and human rights is more than symbolic. It really means putting into action that required lens and approach to achieving the SDGs. And we recognize that the participation of all society, members of society such as yourselves, is really essential to achieve the SDGs. It can't just be a government or member state approach. And more than ever, we're seeing this intersection in reality for various groups um, to further integrate how we try to get the potential of these 17 SDGs. Some of you have might heard the tagline of "Leave no one behind." So with that in mind, that's why it's so important to have um, groups and organizations such as yourselves having this conversation here today. Um, like really the development paradigm, human rights have evolved. So today social development is more of a holistic and incorporates social and environmental dimensions where many human rights are embedded, and human rights considerations can help inform and really support the implementation of the SDGs that can promote inclusion, equity, respect for human dignity. Um, and really, yeah, as I said, like leaving no one behind is really empowering the most vulnerable and ensuring that all partners can actively be included in the participation process. And that's what we want to discuss with you today, is how putting human rights forward can facilitate translating commitments into meaningful action. And I also just came back from New York, like Layla, where I was helping coordinate Canada's participation at the United Nations High Level Political Forum. And as Layla mentioned, so this is an annual forum that really offers countries and organizations the chance to really engage in discussions and showcase achievements and share best practices and also challenges, right, in advancing the 2030 agenda. And I feel like this is also really a great annual event for us to really reflect on, like, where have we made progress? Where have we fallen short? How can we improve over the coming year? And also, most importantly, what can we learn from each other? Um, Unfortunately, the message is clear that was said in New York and is repeated is that the SDGs really remain off track, with only 35% of the SDG targets making moderate progress. So, my reflection on this and my reflection with all of you is I really do feel like there is accountability, obviously, that needs to be put on member states and countries, but I also truly believe in the value of a whole society approach. And that's why we had a Canadian delegation in New York that really reflects our approach to the SDGs. So it's supposed to be an inclusive and whole society approach. And that's what we did, an open call for interest to get a diversity of stakeholders and partners that included civil society organizations, academia, private sector, all levels of government, Indigenous peoples, and youth. And I'm really grateful to participate in this conversation today because I really believe that the SDGs can't progress without unity and, most importantly, without your unwavering devotion, right, to human rights. I don't think this can be done alone. They are a global aspiration and commitment. And I know that we hear this, that we want this commitment to move to action. So I truly do believe that the importance of localizing the SDGs and seeing how that's really part of every community and how these conversations are trying to make the link is really important. So I'll leave it at that. I don't want to take too much time because I'm excited to listen to the panelists and get more into the details. But thank you so much for inviting us. I can also put our email in the chat if you want to stay connected. We are trying to create a national network connecting from coast to coast what people are doing. So we have a listserv with an SDG bulletin, etc. And we are also trying to organize some SDG connections events to keep all of you connected. So please stay in touch online and offline. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. So thank you so much.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Isabel, so much for joining us today and for underscoring how human rights is an enabler and a connector for all of the SDGs. And we are excited to dig in, very excited now to hear from Shalini Konanur, who will provide context, further context on a human rights-based approach for community engagement. And Shalini will also moderate the panel following her presentation. Shalini is the executive director at the and senior lawyer at the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, also known as SALCO. Shalini has worked for over 25 years in Ontario's legal aid clinic system, working primarily with low-income racialized communities. Shalini's work focuses on the intersections of socioeconomic status, race, immigration status, gender identity, faith, and gender-based violence. Shalini has appeared at all levels of court up to the Supreme Court of Canada and has provided expert advice related to racism, discrimination, and gender-based violence to multiple levels of government, civil society organizations, the private sector, and the United Nations. Thank you so much for joining us, Shalini. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Layla, and good morning, everybody. I want to start by saying that I'm coming to you from Richmond Hill, which is on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Mississauga and Chippewa Nations of the Williams Treaty, and also on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat. So good morning to everybody, and thank you for joining us. So I am going to be, in a minute, moderating a panel. But before we do that, I thought I would give you some context around sort of the wider term, a human rights-based approach. And oftentimes I hear sort of these terms, and in my head, they feel very high level. And it takes me a minute to kind of figure out, what does that mean for me? So what I'm going to talk to you about first is, what does it mean for me? And it may mean more, and it may mean something slightly different for all of you, but hopefully it will frame the conversation that we're going to have. And Isabel has done a great job of sort of starting that conversation already. So really, when I think about a human rights-based approach to all of the work that we do and all of the work that we should be doing around the Social Development Goals, the SDGs, I think really that it's recognizing people as rights holders, not just recipients of service. And I have to say that in my years working in the clinic system in Ontario with low-income people, we probably worked with thousands of people at SALCO. And really, it's a critical mind shift for people to think about themselves as rights holders and not recipients of service, right? It also, in that human rights-based approach, not only do we have rights holders, but we have something that I call duty bearers. So those are really the people who have legal obligations under domestic and international law to ensure that those human rights are being affected to the people that they're meant to serve. So we're shifting the conversation, right? We're not talking about what do people need. What we're talking about, and oftentimes we do that in the spaces, our clients need this, our clients need that. We're shifting the language to what are people entitled to and who must deliver on those rights, right? And so it's an interesting thing because I think about my own family often, and my parents immigrated here in the late 60s, early 70s. And they really lived in a world where they didn't feel like they could ask, that they were entitled to things that, in my view, are their fundamental human rights. And so we want to shift that conversation for people across the globe and across Canada in terms of what are we entitled to, right? And really, when I do the human rights based approach work, I think about 5 principles: accountability, which we really heard quite a bit of from Isabel just now; participation, meaning that it's not just a finite group of people who should be participating in this conversation, but the goal of many of us probably in this session today is, how do we open that up to the people whose lives are deeply impacted by what we're talking about? It's about non-discrimination, transparency, and empowerment. So those are kind of the 5 things I think about. And like Isabel, I really do think the 2030 agenda and the SDGs are rooted in human rights standards. If you look at the 17 SDGs, they really align with what our entitled rights are. And that HRBA, that human rights-based approach, connects those dots, right? So we have these fundamental human rights. This is the framework that connects how do we get there, right? Without taking a human rights-based approach, we often run 2, in my opinion, big risks. One, we create technical solutions that don't impact life and are not really just for people. And we've seen that over and over again at our work in SALCO, that governments will sort of, or other duty bearers will create technical solutions. They don't actually trickle down into a fundamental human right for the person they're affecting. We also run the risk of the development that ignores things like systemic racism, colonialism, and inequality, right? So this is why this type of approach is so important. You know, in Canada, our government does a good job of talking in the language of inclusion and reconciliation. But as civil society, we often feel like they're failing to implement policies that uphold substantive human rights. And so you can see there's a little bit of a disconnect and a little bit of not a little bit, a lot of an accountability issue. Currently, you know, we can talk about the continuous relationship with Indigenous communities who, you know, continue to face unsafe water, systemic underfunding, rights violations, and issues around consultation, right? We know in our work at SALCO that racialized communities continue to face over-policing, essentially systemic racism in many aspects of their life, and they're underprotected. We also know that currently in our own country, our immigration and refugee system is changing. And it really, really is, in our view, when we actually work with clients, an imbalance in terms of the human dignity for the people who are coming or who are already here that have precarious immigration status. And so it's critical, right, that we work together in this human rights-based approach. And what's even more critical for me is that civil society plays a fundamental role. So it's no longer the case that a small group of people or duty bearers, like governments, like private institutions, get to make all the choices, right? Civil society must be empowered to be at the table and supported and required, right? Holding governments accountable, amplifying community voices, and making rights real in practice, right? So what does that mean? How can the human rights-based approach be applied, right, to the social development goals? So the SDG 17 already calls for partnership, right? So that's fundamentally there. But that human rights-based approach pushes us to ask, who has the power in these partnerships? Who is shaping this agenda, right? A rights-based partnership has to be equitable, transparent, and accountable to communities. That's the fundamental piece that sometimes we continue to miss. Still, civil society is not where we should be in terms of our power in these partnerships and our ability to shape the agenda. But the reality is we are the ones in civil society, the people across the world, who are the ones impacted the most, right? So in Canada, for me, that means making sure that vulnerable communities, equity deserving communities, racialized communities, Indigenous communities, migrant-led communities are resourced to do that work, included and respected, right? Too often, all of these types of groups are excluded from that type of decision making. Our current partnership model in Canada is a reactive one, sort of an asymmetrical one between state institutions and grassroots groups. And so we have to, in a human rights-based approach, which I think is fundamentally important to the SDG 17, shift that whole dynamic, right? And the failure to do so will actually lead to what Isabel talked about, this very low percentage of uptake on the accountability for what we have promised to deliver in terms of those SDG goals. So really, we're talking about power sharing. We're talking about core sustained funding for communities to build their capacity to be involved and a requirement that they are involved, right? And we've got lots of submissions from civil society on how that can take place. But transforming those partnerships from transactional to transformational is fundamental, right, to that human rights-based approach. And before I jump to our panel, I wanted to really reflect on that with a real life example. So the South Asian Legal Clinic and the Color of Poverty, Color of Change, which is a network across Canada of people who work on the intersection of socioeconomic status, low income, and systemic racism, got a chance several years ago to appear at the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination at the United Nations. And to be honest, what we found there in our engagement with Canada and then in our engagement with the United Nations was that it was very transactional. We were told how much we could submit. We were told that we could go all the way to Geneva and each of us would get 2.5 minutes to speak at the committee. We were told that they would take it into account, and then we were told to get out of the room so that the UN and state actors could speak. And so you can see there that it was really the antithesis at that time, and this is back in 2017, of that human rights-based approach. I have to say in the work following that in the next number of years, there's been significant improvement in our collaboration, particularly domestically with state institutions and government actors. But what I think the reality is that there's this strong desire, even by our government partners that we work with, to advance that critical human rights-based approach, but still not from the top of the political spectrum, a will to do it, right? So everybody's hands are bound by that transactional piece. So I think that it's really critical that we continue to push. So it's very important that we continue to push the SDG 17, but above that, it's very important that we continue to push our own country and continue to push globally that all of those duty bearers, and that's not just states, but there are also private actors that really impact our clients' lives, to take that human rights-based approach in terms of their implementation of all of our international human rights obligations in Canada. And so, when I think about the CERD, they actually did, in their concluding obligations, urge Canada to take a stronger, measurable, rights-based approach. So they recognized actually that we weren't there yet. That recommendation has been a consistent byline in a number of UN committee reviews that have happened after CERD, pushing Canada towards taking that kind of approach and really shifting away from transactionally, like civil society or different partners, you make this quick submission to us and we'll go off and do what we do piece. I have to say they are getting better, Canada is, but I have to say that a lot of work still needs to happen. And finally, I just think about in our own work as civil society that we also are duty bearers, right? I consider myself in this position where I am privileged enough to go and speak for communities, but who am I to speak for communities? So really, we need to coordinate. We need to make sure that we too are reaching out into our communities, talking to people who are on the ground, grassroots, and what is our role in building the capacity of those who are not where we're at, even in our ability to engage. And so, you can be a rights holder and a duty bearer at the same time. And so, I think really fundamentally, that's all I wanted to say to frame the conversation around that human rights-based approach. I do not think you can get to the SDG 17s. You cannot connect the dots if you don't take this approach. If you don't take an approach that brings everyone into the fold in the conversation and shifts from that fundamental question of what services do we need versus what are people entitled to, right? And what should people be demanding? And so I'm going to stop there. And I actually am delighted now to bring together a panel of people who I think are particularly brilliant and we'll be discussing some of this in more detail and also giving you a little bit more of a highlight of the work that they've been doing. And I hope it tweaks all of those of you who are listening, tweaks your minds with some interesting questions. Certainly, I always have a line of questions. I'm always the first person in the class to put up my hand, so I'll be there with you. And so without further ado, I want to introduce all three of our panel members, and then I'm going to pose some questions questions for all three of you. So you've heard from Layla, but I just want to introduce her a little bit more formally than she introduced herself. Layla Sarangi is the Senior Director of Strategy and Innovation at Family Services Toronto, a large multi-service organization with community programs for people with mental health challenges who have experienced gender-based violence, and for adults and children labeled with developmental disabilities. She's also the national director of Campaign 2000, End Child and Family Poverty, a pan-Canadian coalition of over 120 organizations that came about in response to a 1989 unanimous all-party federal resolution to end child poverty by the year 2000, hence the name Campaign 2000. Layla brings with her over 25 years of nonprofit leadership, coalition building, and government relations experience. She's a seasoned campaigner, community builder, and felicitator with a deep passion for connecting lived experience to social action and public policy development to achieve long-term system change using intersectional and trauma-informed praxis. I also want to introduce to you Zia Ur-Rehman, who is the Secretary General and Director of the Asia Development Alliance. Zia is a mathematician turned social activist. He is well known as a development advocate and lobbyist, community-level civil and political rights activist, writer, and poet in the development of sector, especially in Asia and around the globe. He has conceived and conducted many studies on women, girls, and young people's rights in Pakistan. He founded and led the Pakistan Development Alliance, a forum of national NGOs and CSOs working together for implementation of the SDGs with a focus on governance and accountability processes in Pakistan, and presented the first ever citizens-led mechanism report on SDGs voluntary national review process in Pakistan during the HLPF at UN headquarters in New York in 2019. And then finally, but certainly also incredible, Natalie Appleyard, who goes by the pronouns she and her, is the socioeconomic policy analyst at Citizens for Public Justice, an organization inspired by faith to act for justice. Natalie brings a background in education to policy research and analysis, public education, and nonpartisan political advocacy related to poverty and equity in Canada. Natalie is a steering committee member of Campaign 2000, a board member of the Canadian Health Coalition, and a convener of We Go Together Network, a group of NGOs, professional associations, labor, community service organizations, faith communities, and academics who are all committed to advancing rights-based approaches to Canadian public policy. Natalie grew up and lives on the unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabeg territory with her husband, 2 kids, 2 cats, and much gratitude. Thank you, all 3 of you, for joining us. Layla, I'm going to turn to you first with my first question. You recently led a research project focused on localizing SDG 1, no poverty, grounded in a human rights-based approach. Can you talk a little bit about why was it important to begin with a human rights-based approach to engagement and partnerships right from the outset? And what were some of the lessons learned after implementing this approach?
Thank you so much for that generous introduction and for the question, Shalini. As you were setting the context and explaining what a human rights-based framework is, actually everything you said resonated with me. And I think that the way we approached this 3-year community-based research project was really striving to actionize all of the things that you talked about for those very reasons. So what I'll do maybe is just talk a little bit about what the project is and pull on some of the themes that you spoke about. So yeah, Campaign 2000 works on issues of anti-poverty. Family Service Toronto, the people who come to us for service have been destabilized by precarious socioeconomic circumstances. So we have a lot of experience locally and across the country working in communities who are challenged with living on low incomes, high density, remote areas, some rural areas, and all of the intersections as they play out in Canada that you spoke about, racism, but also ableism, transphobia, homophobia, all of those big isms. And because we're working on issues of poverty, the federal government here in Canada has a poverty reduction strategy. It was released in 2018 and legislated, enshrined into legislation in 2019, the first poverty reduction strategy. And that is the government's action plan of how they're going to achieve SDG number 1, no poverty. The goals, there's 2 targets in that strategy, and that is to reduce poverty by 20% by 2018, looking from 2015 measure, and then to reduce poverty in half by 2030. Both of those targets were achieved during the year of the pandemic in 2020. Actually, they were exceeded with federal interventions to support people during the pandemic. So one is that we felt as people who are working in community, who come from these communities and working in these communities, felt that those targets were not ambitious enough. We believe there is a lot more government intervention that can be happening. And we know that because we're in these communities. And so we really wanted to bring that voice to the forefront to help shape some of these strategies and targets. We received funding from the SDG unit to do a 3-year community-based research project to define indicators for the federal government to use in their work of ending poverty according to the SDGs. For communities, what does a community with no poverty look like, feel like, smell like, and how do we turn that into an indicator framework for the federal government? These 2 poverty measures, reducing poverty by 20% in 2018 and 50% by 2030, leaves out quite a lot of people. The official measure, we didn't have an official poverty measurement until that strategy was released. The official poverty measurement is called the market basket measure. It costs out these baskets of goods and services that a family will need to be able to purchase within their region in the country to be considered not living in poverty. So myself, as a mother with 3 children living in a high density urban center, I have a particular threshold. If with my disposable income, I can afford those baskets of goods and services, that's been developed by, the federal government, then I'm not considered to be living in poverty. If I can't afford those, then I'm considered to be living in poverty. It's a very consumption-based measure of poverty. And the data that goes into creating those measures, the survey is quite small. It doesn't include people who tend to have higher rates of poverty in Canada. So for example, people who are living on First Nation reserves, you mentioned boil water advisories, those families are not included. The territories, anybody living in the territories are not included. We work with people with developmental disabilities, anybody living in congregate settings, institutions of any kind are not counted. Those in highly remote areas are not counted in these surveys, but that is the data that we are using to measure our progress towards no poverty. So it really is, by its nature, the way it's been developed, very exclusionary. We had a desire as Family Service Toronto and Campaign 2000 to redefine the measure by directly going to those communities who are affected and asking them what their experiences are. And let's create these definitions that can be translated into policy goals. And so we went to every province and territory to speak to folks. We actually, before we even did that, we created a principle-based approach to our community-based research. We had a document that every methodology that we used in the research, we looked at our principles and we asked ourselves, do they meet these principles in action? And Shalini, they really reflected the principles that you described, and I would add one. And the one that I would add is reciprocity. Are the communities who we are working in defining the benefits that they are receiving from engagement with us? And how are we coming to an agreement and understanding, given the time that we had and the resources we had, can we meet those and have an honest conversation based in relationship that we've developed and provide that and keep ourselves accountable? Because you're right, we did part of our indicator or part of our research framework before we went in. We acknowledged ourselves, the researchers, as duty bearers, and we wanted to shift that power dynamic. We didn't want to be researchers who parachuted into a community, asked a number of questions, and took that information and put it in a report that nobody could read or understand, and it wasn't living and it didn't translate. We actually really intentionally shifted that power dynamic by first developing relationships, defining what that reciprocity looks like, being honest about what we can and can't provide. So when I went into a community, we were very clear, our team was very clear that, in engaging with us, people's lives may not be materially different afterwards. I can't promise that. But what I can promise is to ensure the reports we wrote really reflected what we were hearing. So we built in a process of going back into communities and getting consent before we published anything. I could promise that the meetings that we were brokering with federal officials, that if communities wanted to be there, we would bring them into those meetings. We would make sure their voices were at those tables. Those were the kinds of things that we could promise and that we could deliver on. So we went to every province and territory. We spoke to folks and we developed this indicator framework for the federal government. I want to get to the question what we learned out of it. When we first started the project, community organizations who we were building relationships with were a little bit hesitant at first. They were telling us that, our communities are over consulted. How many consultations do people spend time engaging in? They have to find childcare, they have to get somewhere. They may take time off work to engage in these processes, and then nothing is changing. And in fact, things are getting worse. Things are getting materially worse in their communities and harder. And so why should they encourage their participants or support participants to engage with us? And I think one of the things we learned is that the outcome of implementing this rights-based and principled approach, one of the biggest benefits was building community both in the session itself. People had a lot of connection and were connecting in that room with each other and creating community and support. And then also across the country, we had a few national events afterwards and people engaged with us. And those connection points, I think, are just as important as the policy changes as well. So I think the actionizing of this rights-based approach is the creating community. We have these big existential threats coming down at us. This is what we heard in New York, right? Climate change, governments pulling funding out from UN processes, economic instability, deep fractures. So what is going to get us through? It is this community building. It is this, relational, local work and connection. That's what's going to really be there at the end of, the day. So we learned that these processes are important. They build community, and they do. My last point that I do want to say is that they do require resourcing. We had never been resourced to do this kind of work before. We had, incredible support from Isabel and her team. to be able to go and into the communities and support them to engage with us. All of the community organizations receive funding through us to participate. Individuals receive funding from us to participate. And that part was really key. We wouldn't have been able to do it without that. So I'll leave it there, I think, and follow up on anything in the question period.
Thanks so much, Layla. And I couldn't agree with you more on the value of sort of local community building. And sometimes what we've seen in our own work is facilitating those conversations has led to local solutions that work in that community that I would never have thought about, right? And so that's where we have that exactly what you said, that flip between rights bearers, duty holders, and what we can do as well. And absolutely, we are living in an unprecedented sort of global time where these conversations are so critical. So Zia, I want to jump next to you, if that's okay. And what I was thinking about was, as the Asia Development Alliance, the ADA continues to support and facilitate civil society engagement in the VNRs, the voluntary national reviews, and the VLRs, which are the voluntary local reviews of the Sustainable Development Goals across Asia. We really do want to hear from you. We would love to hear about, based on your own experience, to what extent have these VNRs and VLR processes meaningfully integrated that human rights-based approach? Have they been inclusive, participatory, accountable in addressing the needs of marginalized people? We'd love to hear some specific examples, challenges, and the lessons you've learned in doing that type of work.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Shalini, for inviting me to deliver a talk on this human rights-based approach and its connection with the VNR and the VLR processes. Not reflect on the human rights-based approaches. You have already done it very aptly, and I must appreciate the conversation that we have till now. I I am participating the high-level political forum. Right now I'm in US, and I had this opportunity to see Laila yesterday. But I'm based in Islamabad, Pakistan, and I uh, uh, represent. This is just for the audience that I also represent Indus Valley civilization. Um, and then I have a very rich culture in Pakistan. So coming back to the topic, unfortunately, the human rights based approaches were not really inculcated in the VNR and the VLR processes, although UNDESA and the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, in their handbooks and in their recommendations, they had actually suggested all the governments that we should follow the human rights based approaches. We should ensure the part should ensure the accountability mechanisms. Civil society organizations in various countries in Asia, that was why they were actually sharing their spotlight reports. Most of the time, they were sharing, as you mentioned in my intro, that we did this Citizens' Voices report for the first time in 2019 when Pakistan was presenting. Um, we were invited by the SDG unit in Pakistan to contribute into the official VNR. Um, we went into 42 districts. More than 4,000 people were consulted. We had a consultation with all the high-risk groups, including people living with disabilities, transgender community, minority people, and the others. But whatever we actually brought from the grassroots, uh, the government did not pick that report. They even did not share um, 2 lines about our voluntary national review contributions in their official reports. Um, and then we were like compelled to publish that report, and I personally presented that first ever Citizens Voices report on VNRs to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, in 2019. So, and that was actually highlighted everywhere, that this is the first ever Citizens Voices report. When we actually went to the people and we asked about the SDGs in 2019, nobody knew about the SDGs. And this is the critical point. When we talk about the human rights based approach, I think we should also think that the understanding about these jargons that we usually use is very, very limited. So what we did, that we translated the SDGs into the local uh, language. The indicators that we developed was not that of the global indicators that we have, 247 global indicators. We developed the local indicators. Like, for example, if I may ask anybody sitting in New York, do you know about the SDG 3? He will behave like, what? So, but if I will ask, are you satisfied with the quality of health services being provided by the New York City Hospital? He will definitely respond me a little bit on that, and he will reflect on that. So what we did is that we actually transformed all those global indicators into the local indicators. And if you just Google the citizens dashboard on SDGs, you will find out the SDG citizens dashboard for Pakistan, that actually gives you an idea that how we try to engage with the citizens at large, and we produce that report. Uh, in fact, when I talk about Asia, in Asia, Japan is the only country actually that initiated this human rights based approach inculcation in their VNR processes. They were the first in introducing the voluntary local review processes. The reason was that they integrated SDGs into their national curriculum, followed by Malaysia. Malaysia is also doing that. So Japan has integrated these SDGs in their national curriculum. Malaysia did another good thing, that, and this is one of the best practice, that they engaged their political leadership. They did this constituency level monitoring through the VNR processes. They did that monitoring, and then that actually created a kind of conversation within their parliament, that look, the constituency of this political leader is better and better on the SDGs, and that political leader is not progressing well. So that is somehow a very, very good example that I think the people should follow. In Nepal, Nepal also did human rights based good practice, where they actually engaged the National Human Rights Institution in developing the protocols for the VNR process, and they were engaged, and then their recommendations were also followed by the by the government of Nepal. But in most of the countries, in most of the other countries, the human rights based approach was not followed in Asia. One good example that I can share with you is from Indonesia, where they actually went down to the village level. And today, in Indonesia, we see that more than 70,000 villages are known as SDG villages. So this is such a wonderful example of Indonesia. We did this study in Asia in 2022, and we found out these good practices that I'm sharing with you right now. One challenge that we see that, yeah, the civil society is being engaged. Some of the citizens are also being engaged in these processes. And when we prepare the report, uh, government doesn't take any part of that report to the official report. And if somehow we try to influence the SDG units, maybe planning commissions, so they add some of our reflection in their reports, but at the end of the day, when it is presented at the United Nations high level political forum by the MOFA, like Ministry of Foreign Affairs people, they cut everything from that report. Like I have this example in 2022. We were again invited by the government. We contributed a lot and we reflected through the human rights based approaches. Um, our contribution was not added in the report. Rather, the report, which was actually shared with us by the Planning Commission of Pakistan, that report was totally changed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I don't know what is the process and the culture in Canada. Isabel will tell us that if she is preparing that VNR report and whether their report is also somehow tweaked by the MOFA, considering the so-called national interest that we see in our countries in global South. So the, what I would recommend is that a pact for the future that we adopted towards the midway of the SDGs, that gives us an opportunity to come back to the human rights based approaches. Most of the national action plans around the SDGs implementation and the processes of the VNRs are outdated after this Pact for the Future adoption. So what I would recommend is that we should push our governments to align the SDG priorities, particularly the VNR processes, through the Pact for the Future, because that has much of the human rights based agenda in it, intergenerational linkages, knowledge. Then it also has this governance and youth engagement. So I think that would also that would be helpful in promoting human rights based approaches through our voluntary national review processes. Secondly, the localization. Localization is very, very important. And as I shared with you, that this culture of voluntary local review is not that much popular in global south. We need to actually invest more on that. We can only engage the citizens at large, and we can only hold our states accountable through the citizens if we engage with the local governments. 65% of the total SDGs are expected to be achieved through the local governance. So the localization is very, very important. And third and the final suggestion that I may be able to give to you and the audience is that it's really, really important to engage with the high risk groups, because it's important. Most of the time we neglect them in our conversations. We do not engage with them. um, they are not closer to the capitals, and VNR processes and the conversations are held closer to the capitals, and it takes only the momentum when there is a HLPF, high level political forum. So pre and post momentum is fine, but as Laila also said, this is transactional. We need to actually try to actually build the momentum, and it should continue. We should reach out to them more regular basis so as we can listen from them and learn from them and contribute in our voluntary national reviews. I'll stop here, but I will answer the questions if any.
Thank you so much, Zia. I mean, that was just illuminating. And I think from the Canada perspective, a lot of us in civil society have had like feelings of shocking failure around local engagement, right? Getting our provinces, getting our municipalities to engage. And you're absolutely right that the life of my own clients is actually more impacted by what happens locally than it is by federal government. So where our engagement with the federal government has improved, it really, has still been a big hole locally, provincially, like where people's lives are. And your example of Indonesia and really going locally into villages is an incredible one. And it also reminds me, when I talked at the beginning about participation as a fundamental part, participation includes accessibility. Like most of my clients, if you talk to them and said, listen, we have these SDGs and this highlight, they will have no idea what we're talking about. So there's work to be done on some of the things that Natalie is working on and will flow from around education. And how do we crystallize that into what does it even mean for a person's life so that they can feel that entitlement piece, right? And so I'm going to jump to Natalie, our last speaker. And Natalie's been doing a lot of work on poverty, right? And poverty itself can sometimes seem to people like an insurmountable challenge. And I felt that even more in the past 5 years than I ever have in the 25 years I've been working in this area. And you further highlighted many of the interconnections amongst a wide range of human rights issues and sectors. Sometimes this can lead to a sense of overwhelm, right? Feeling overwhelmed. That might actually prevent people from engaging at all. In your experience, what has been helpful in overcoming this sense of overwhelm and paralysis? And what do you think Canadian governments could be doing better to support civil society, NGO engagement to advance human rights and the agenda of 2030?
Thanks, Shalini, and thanks to my fellow panelists. So I think, really the solution to this sense of overwhelm and the complexity of what we're facing is to see that all these interconnections, this intersectionality among people's experiences and underlying systems of oppression is really what makes these partnerships so important. And it's important and has its own challenges and opportunities, as we've heard, because of, on one hand, this increased complexity can make it seem really overwhelming and really difficult to know how to begin, how to engage. But it also allows us to build out our shared understanding, to build our solidarity, to build that sense of community and ultimately our collective power. And so there's some really great opportunities there in addressing the complexity of this issue and seeing it as multiple points of entry. So for an example, because we at Citizens for Public Justice, or CPJ, have three main issue areas, which are poverty, refugee and migrant rights, and climate justice, we can bring these lenses to our respective areas of focus and build broader networks of partners. So when we advocate for climate action, we're thinking about how those policies will impact folks with low income. When we think about what our immigration and refugee policies should look like, we want to consider what is Canada's fair share given our contribution to climate change globally. When we think about poverty in Canada, we want to consider who can access income supports and programs based on their immigration status. We think about the migrant workers that uphold our economy who don't themselves have access to adequate housing or food security. We think about how poverty and inadequate housing are disproportionately impacted by climate change-induced heat waves, floods, and storms. And at our best, when we are working together across these issues and working together in partnership, we can rally our members and partners who care passionately about each of these issues to show up for other sectors and other communities, practice that solidarity, practice that power sharing that you described earlier, Shalini, and make sure that we're centering the voices of those most impacted. So partnering across these issues and addressing the complexity of these issues is really about intersectionality. And I think we have a really nice parallel with the indivisibility of our human rights and our treaty rights obligations as well. So while my work focuses specifically on poverty in Canada, it's really the story of inequity in Canada. And I know both you and Leila spoke to that. And so the reality is that the people who are disproportionately impacted by poverty, food insecurity, housing insecurity, et cetera, overlap significantly with the folks who are disproportionately impacted by climate change and environmental degradation. And likewise with those most impacted by our policies related to migration, refugees, and our criminal justice system in general. So taking a human rights-based approach to these issues in all their complexity and working in partnership across sectors, it really allows us to name and address these common underlying root causes and systems of oppression. So we heard from you earlier, Shalini, about the need to shift our mindset from one of, providing services and finding out what do people need, and frankly, operating from a more charitable mindset where we like to pat ourselves on the back for our magnanimous decision to provide income supports or affordable housing, right? As opposed to seeing people as rights holders and understanding that governments and other institutions, as you've mentioned in Canada, are duty bearers and that they have a responsibility to create the conditions where everyone living in this country has access to their human rights. And of course, there are specific rights also for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada as well. So taking a human rights-based approach allows us to really name what's actually going on here. What is causing this situation? What is perpetuating this situation? And it also provides us with some guiding principles that can inform the way we work together, the way we organize, so that we can, again, model this kind of anti-oppressive power sharing and the kind of centering of lived experience that we're calling for in our public policies. We have to make sure that we're doing that ourselves, and that can be, as we've heard, really uplifting, really encouraging for people to experience that sense of agency, to experience that sense of community, and to see other people showing up in solidarity and seeing other people show up who have their backs. And this is so important because one of the challenges of working across issues is that we're often told that we're asking for too much or asking for too many things. And sometimes the people that we're lobbying or talking with even try to pit our issues against one another, as though we have to choose between economic security and climate justice, or between adequate housing supply and welcoming refugees. So working together across these issues helps us to debunk these false dichotomies, false solutions, and just plain scapegoating and misdirection, to demand rights-based solutions that are effective and equitable and that mean better outcomes for everyone. So the human rights-based approach across sectors through these partnerships really help us to have consistency in what we're calling for, even if we have different specific policy recommendations. So our partners that are working on income security at the provincial level or the federal level are going to have some really specific asks. And then our friends that are working on housing or climate, we've all got our grocery lists of policies that we'd like to see changed, right? But we can come together and say that we support one another because we know that progress in one area or failure in one area is inextricably linked to all these other issue areas. So it allows us to, again, name what's actually going on and identify workable solutions that are based in evidence, based in human rights, and based in people's lived experience. So the only other piece that I'll quickly mention in terms of a challenge and opportunity is that of capacity. And we've heard about this already as well. So on the one hand, we can come together to share the work, share resources, and increase our collective power. But on the other hand, so many of us are already operating so beyond capacity, and so many of us are dependent on funding that is project-based, that it can be really hard to take the time that is needed to build relationship, to consult and engage meaningfully, and ensure, again, that the people that are typically excluded from these processes, from these decision-making policies, are included and centered. And so we really need that support from governments to provide core funding for, you know, the direct service work that people are doing, but also for this kind of partnership and collaboration, and understanding that you know, it's always a little bit tricky when you're working on advocacy to find funding, right? And I think by really focusing on evidence-based, rights-based approaches, we can try to take, I know we can never take the politics out of anything, but we can certainly try to remove the partisan nature of the discussion and really say, what do we know actually works based on what people in our communities are experiencing and telling us. And so this kind of partnership can be really powerful when it works. I can think of an example during the pandemic when, you know, all the anti-poverty organizations were just swamped, particularly those organizations that do both frontline service delivery and advocacy, right? Like, their community needs were just through the roof. They didn't have the capacity to go and network and organize coalition. I mean, they did it anyway, but you know who did have time was the environmental NGOs. And they were also concerned about what was going on at this time. And so there was this void that was kind of created where the ENGOs kind of stepped in to talk about principles of a just recovery and how do we build back better. But I would say in an unprecedented way in sort of the Canadian landscape, from what I can see, they really were much more intentional about engaging with anti-poverty groups and engaging with migrants' rights groups. So, you know, there have sometimes been critiques that environmentalism and climate change adaptations can sometimes be rather elitist. And so I saw that as a really wonderful example of how, you know, how that intentional partnership and that solidarity building really shaped the kinds of recommendations that those environmental groups brought forward, because they had the time and capacity to do it at that time when we didn't. And similarly, you know, also we'll just share that some work that Citizens for Public Justice and Campaign 2000 and Canada Without Poverty were involved in through the Dignity for All campaign, which really led to the release of Canada's first poverty reduction strategy that Leila spoke to. We were responsible for 70% of their online consultation submissions when they were seeking civil society engagement. And so, you know, there can be some big wins, but certainly there are capacity and funding constraints. And, you know, it can be difficult, honestly, to find like one rallying cry that encompasses the complexity of what we're facing, but is also winnable, meaningful, and easy to define in a single sentence.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Yeah, I think what's so interesting about it is between all four of us, we've sort of connected on some common themes. We're running short on time, so I would actually like to open it up to Q&A, because I think lots of my learning always in these sessions is from when people are asking questions. I just wanted to check. We do have a Q&A box, but also we're a small group, so I'm amenable to if people want to just raise their hands and ask any any questions that they have, and I want to give you the space to do that for a second. Is there anyone who'd like to pose a question to our panel? I always have a million questions, but I want to give our participants a chance as well. And just check. I see that there is something in the Q&A, so let me just pull that up first. Or is it in the chat? Hannah, do we see anything from the Q&A or the chat or our participants? It's hard for me to take a look.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's one in the chat. How about should I read it out?
That would be lovely. Thank you.
Perfect. So we have from Shreyosi, thank you for the insightful presentation. My question is, how do you feel about the impact of governments across the world pulling back on human rights obligations in the name of economic advancement?
Well, I have lots of things to say, but I'm going to open it up to our panelists first. Please jump in and let us know what you're thinking.
Should I?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I think this is the biggest challenge, particularly in the global south. We see lots of new regulatory frameworks restricting civil society organizations to engage with because they are quite scared of whatever the agendas they are pulling through their governments, and we see that a lots of right wingers are now coming up everywhere in the world, cutting the ODA, restricting the civil society organizations, shrinking the spaces, and also shrinking the resources. So it's a challenging time. And to me, I think it's also an opportunity for the civil society organization across the globe to come together. In fact, what we did over the period of last 2 decades, we uh, left our spaces. We did it unintentionally, or maybe we were like very much comfortable in doing some of the uh, parallel service work to the government. Much of our civil society organizations were planning that we may have more resources in doing humanitarian actions and services delivery kind of work. But as far as the rights-based agenda is concerned, we left our spaces, and we need to reclaim those spaces so as we can actually hold our governments and also the corporates accountable. They are misusing and abusing the power every now and then. They have this nexus, but unfortunately, the civil society and the citizens don't have any nexus. So we have to build that, and we need to address that disconnection. Uh, Secondly, I think civil society organization, and when I was talking earlier about this um, reaching out to the citizens, I think it's really, really important. Our agendas should come from the citizens. And that is the only solution to build more equitable and egalitarian societies. If the agendas would come from the top, like Pact for the Future, that was also, was an agenda that was adopted half the way, and now we are being pushed that we should actually try to inculcate that agenda into the SDGs. And somehow, Laila, if you might have noticed that we are now seeing these XDGs, XDGs, the boards on the walls of UN, and they are saying that this is something like new for 2045. So every now and then we have been actually receiving these agendas and not translating really to the citizens and not listening to them. So the problem for our economic and justice, and maybe I think for others. One campaign that we are part of, I should introduce over here also. This is Economic Justice Campaign that has a slogan of stand with the billions and not billionaires. We launched that campaign over here in the sidelines of the HLPF. And it has been actually taking momentum for the economic justice in the world. That has three major pillars. We want that there should be a revision of the international financial architecture. We think that this international financial architecture is non-democratic and irresponsive to the needs of the globe. We also want that there should be a debt restructuring paradigm. There should be a UN framework on sovereign debts, because most of the global southern countries are under severe debt and they don't actually invest more on public health, social protection, education, so on and so forth. So I think these are some of the important campaigns that are actually underway, and we should take part in these kind of campaigns. Thank you. I will leave.
Yeah, I love all of your examples because they feel so hopeful. In sometimes in that world that we talked about, Natalie, of overwhelm. I don't know if either of you, Leila or Natalie, have some comments here. Certainly in Canada, in the name of economic advancement, most recently, we've done a flip on how we interact with Indigenous communities, for sure. And we're in the middle of that right now. And I think many of us are worried about, in the name of economic advancement, what will be pulled back in terms of the human rights-based approach and in terms of actually valuing the human rights that, we're obligated and entitled to make sure are fundamental to people's lives. Leila, Natalie, do you want to jump in on that question?
I'll jump in quickly, Natalie, if that's okay. And I think there's, pardon me, I think there's a false dichotomy when we set up human rights and social development against economic development. And this is the new narrative in Canada right now. And civil society organizations are really coming together to say, actually, the two are connected. And when we build out our social protections and we really address inequality along all of those lines of discrimination, we have more prosperous communities. We build local economic development solutions, and that is the way forward. So we need to really shift that thinking around those false dichotomies and the setups. The other thing I want to say is, Zia, I really appreciate you here with your Global South perspective and so many amazing ideas that we can learn from in the Global North, where we're located. We are a wealthy country. There is no excuse for this kind of deep inequality that we see in Canada. 1.4 million children living in poverty in Canada. Significantly high rates of poverty for people living in First Nations communities who have a direct relationship with our federal government. As you said at the outset, Shalini, severe underfunding and violation of treaty rights, ongoing discrimination and colonization. We have enough resources. We have to have that political will to really invest. I love this idea, Zia, of support the billions and not the billionaires. And in Canada, we have a lot of, protections for the billionaires. We have a handful of them. It's not many, but there is tax restructuring that can happen, and we can use this very powerful mechanism to redistribute the great wealth in this nation and really lift up everybody. So yeah, I'm really just appreciating that question and this conversation, and really encourage our thinking to get out of those binaries, and that part of the actionizing of the human rights-based approach that I think governments can do is really building out that social protection, really redistributing that wealth and using the levers that are available for that.
Yeah, I would just add in addition to it being a false dichotomy, it's also just like patently false that it's cheaper to respond the way we are currently, or to shift towards privatization, or to cut social services. We know that costs us more money. So, we always try to center a human rights-based approach where it's really about what people are entitled to, but there is also this economic argument for it too, right? And so the fact that they're trying to use an economic against this approach is just patently false. And to Leila's point, we in Canada absolutely have the resources to invest, as other countries have chosen to do. And so there is ample evidence that investing in publicly funded, publicly delivered pharmacare, Medicare, housing saves us money. So it's kind of absurd. And the other principle I've mentioned, and Leila, you were just getting into this, that I find really really helpful in a human rights-based approach is this principle of maximum available resources, that the Canadian government and other duty bearers have a responsibility to devote maximum available resources to progressively realize these rights, and that includes economic, social, and cultural rights. And so that doesn't just mean our spending, it also means the way that we generate the revenue to invest. And it means how we decide where those investments will be targeted and how that money will be spent and who gets prioritized. So that's where I'll stop.
I love that answer. I know we're running short on time, but there's a second question, and I want to take just a minute or two of our before our closing to talk about it, because it's the question of data, right? And the question in the chat is really around how can we support grassroots data from all of the sort of the countries across the world to integrate into UN data. I think it's a really important one, because the Color of Poverty has been doing data work for a long time. And it goes back to what Zia kind of alluded to, in that our governments or our sort of state actors sometimes take data and present it in an international sphere that is not representative of what's happening on the ground, right? And so I think if anyone has comments, I would plug for not just state actors being the holders of the collection of data, but in fact supporting grassroots data, disaggregated data collection that actually is used and then informs both locally at a national level and at an UN level. The data that we get in our own work at the South Asian Legal Clinic can inform much more the agenda setting that Zia talked about than the data maybe that StatsCan would collect, right? And so if anyone has some closing comments on that data piece, I'd love to hear them. I'm going to give you like 2 minutes, and then I'll be throwing it back to Leila to close us off. Does anyone want to jump in on that data piece?
Okay, I think this data issue is quite challenging, and what we have observed is that most of the data is not reliable, and it's very unfortunate. The reports that we see from the even international level, from the global level, are are not really representative and based on reality. Say, for example, I just take this example because it has been happening for many years. Pakistan's gender gap report by the World Economic Forum, we stand last in the world. I don't see that the culture and the situation over there is so bad that we are the last in the world. There are so many other countries, including Afghanistan, neighboring to us, where even the girls are not allowed to enter into the schools, and there are so many other challenges. So I think that mostly the global forums are depending upon the data that they are extracting from the UN reports, and they are extracting from some of the government reports, and government by by many ways, they even do not trust their own data, unfortunately, while they refer to different reports. So to me, I think reliable data would be a blessing if we get somewhere, but it's quite challenging. And SDGs particularly, if we try to understand that how much of the percentages have been achieved. Now we are seeing that is 35%. Uh, but what is actually the basis of this 35%? Because when we go down to the people and see the situation, even in today's conversation, we found out that the achievement of the SDGs in Canada is also challenging. So to me, I think we do not have a reliable data at hand, and with this digitalization of the governance and this pact for the future has that digital governance, there may have been a chance that we will have some more reliable data in future to whom that would be really helpful for our decision making, informed decision making. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sia. To keep us almost on time, I want to just really close by saying for me, it's just been an absolute honor and pleasure to be able to sit with the three of you in this virtual space and all of the people who helped us to put this together and have this important conversation. It's definitely a starting point, not a finishing point. And I'm going to pass it over to Leila to just close us off.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank the panelists for joining us today, for the staff who really organized us while many of us were in New York. So thanks to the staff and thanks to each of you for joining us today. Please do continue to stay in touch with us. I believe our website and information is in the chat, so please do stay in touch with us. Canada will be presenting its next VNR, Voluntary National Review, in 2027. So we do have a year and a half to try to engage and bring these human rights-based approaches into the review, working with folks like Isabel and others to try and support the work from this perspective. So there are opportunities on the horizon. Thanks to each of you, Miigwech, and have a good day.